Welcome to Taiwan Report News Brief, news analysis and context from Taichung, Taiwan. I'm Donovan Smith. All right, so this topic turned into a much bigger subject than I was originally anticipating. So I've broken it down into a three-part series. So that's why you haven't seen any shows for a little over a week. But this one really turned into quite a monster. So, all right, let's dive in. So earlier this year, the excellent Academia Sinica political scientist Nathan Batto put up a post on his Frozen Garlic blog entitled The 2020 Surge in Youth Turnout. Now, I'll repost that as a must-read on our website, report.tw, so you can check it out, which I highly recommend. I also highly recommend you check out his blog. It's incredibly smart and informative, and I've learned a lot from his insights. In fact, all my fellow political junkies, at least those working in English, swear by his work. Though he's not posting that very often these days, I still check it every day just in case. Now, the name Frozen Garlic comes from the chants of get elected in Taiwanese, which sounds like frozen garlic in Mandarin, so it's a bit of an inside joke. Oh, and according to Commonwealth magazine, quote, Batto is a golden-haired, bright-eyed American citizen. So, now you know. Now, this particular post of his was a bombshell, and I've been thinking on it since. So let me quote from it. In 2016 and 2018, turnout for people in their 20s was somewhere around 55 to 60%. As the age of voters increased, so did turnout, peaking at over 70% among voters in their late 60s. There was a huge gap in turnout between young and old voters. 2020 didn't look like that at all. More than 70% of young voters turned out. Turnout increased with age, but not nearly as much as in the past. There is an enormous gap between the lines for young voters in 2016 and 2020, and only a small one among older voters. End quote. Now, prior to his post coming out, he mentioned to me in a PM that it was about a huge surge in youth voting in 2020. My jaw dropped. How could it be that they came out in droves in 2020, but not in 2016, right after the sunflower movement? That didn't seem right. He said he had the same question. Now, that's the topic I'm going to attempt to address in this three-part series. I'll also talk about how, in a sense, it was a second youth protest movement. Now, the Froze is a political scientist and didn't speculate on the why part of this because he'll only go as far as the data goes. I'm a political analyst and commentator, so I can speculate wildly and with reckless abandon. But first, before I tackle that, let me flesh the topic out a bit more and steal more from his post. His data is from a study that, to quote his post, was commissioned by the Central Election Commission, which has a legal mandate to investigate any potential gender disparities. It is normally strictly forbidden to look at actual voting records due to Taiwan's strict privacy laws. However, for this special purpose, the CEC allowed them to look at some voter rolls. They took a sample of precincts and then took a sample of voters from each of these selected precincts. For each voter, they collected age, sex, and whether the voter had showed up to vote. They did not record how each voter voted. That is not recorded on the voter rolls or anywhere else. They eventually recorded data for over 137,000 eligible voters, and this should be a pretty darn good representative sample, end quote. Yeah, that's about as good a sample as you could hope for. Now, the next bit is a bit of a diversion, but interesting nonetheless. Again, to quote him, since the official purpose of the report is to study gender differences, we should first look at the differences between men and women. Young women have somewhat higher turnout, roughly 5% higher than young men. The gender gap shrinks with age until turnout is roughly the same for voters in their late 60s. Among the very old, men vote at higher rates than women. Overall, turnout in the 2020 presidential election was 76.7% for women and 73.2% for men. We saw similar trends in 2016 and 2018. I don't have much to say, that's him, by the way, to say about gender right now. Eventually, that's him, going to try and figure out if young women vote differently than older women. Newcomers to Taiwanese politics are always shocked that women are about 5% more pro-KMT than men, since the much-publicized gender gap in the United States favors the more progressive party. My, meaning him, suspicion is that older women are much more conservative than younger women, i.e., the age difference for voting behavior is much larger for women than men. But I don't have any hard evidence of that right now. This topic will have to wait for another time, end quote. Actually, in the last election, in a lot of the polling, women were supporting the KMT and Hangguoyu by about 10 points more than men. I'd love it if he took up this topic. Now, I attempted to use other data as a proxy to try and confirm the older women are more conservative theory, which, by the way, is my suspicion as well. I found some things that were suggestive, but not definitive. For example, support for parties that are favored by younger voters, like the New Power Party and Taiwan State Building Party, is roughly even among men and women. Another is that just looking at the crowds that showed up to support Hangguoyu, it was obviously dominated by older women. And support for Han was concentrated in the older demographics. Now, none of these things are proof, of course, just suggestive. All right, I'm going to stop it right here and be sure to tune in for part 2 of this series. And the next part, I'm going to be going very deeply into the Sunflower Movement, which is the first of the 2 youth uprisings. That sets the stage for part 3 because there's continuity between the two, but also some differences. And I want to get into using the Sunflower Movement as, as the set piece for why the turnout was lower after the Sunflower Movement than in 2020. So be sure to tune in for parts 2 and 3, and be sure to hit like and subscribe. If you're on YouTube, be sure to hit that little bell. And of course, as always, we very, very much appreciate our patrons who support us. It's very important to us, and it's a very emotional show of support for us. We really do appreciate it very, very much. All right, look forward to the next part.
This has been brought to you by the Taiwan Report. For more content like this, become our patron at report.tw.
还有就是那个台湾狗啦，最喜欢我的台湾狗了。